Hi, it's Matt McLachlan with a special invitation. If you'd like to join me and my team of outstanding historians to walk the ground where these videos were made, visit our website and join one of our battlefield tours. That's battlefields.com.au. Enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to another episode of Living History. Joining me today to talk about some pretty special World War II topics is our regular co-host. It's Karl James from the Australian War Memorial. Karl, welcome back, mate.
G'day, mate. Thanks for having me back.
Now, mate, before we get started, let's talk about, you've had a busy week in terms of the world of history and also rock music, but that's a separate topic. But you've been to a pretty interesting conference. Do you want to just fill us in on that one? Because we were talking about it before we started recording, and I think it will be of great interest to our listeners and our viewers on YouTube.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. So it has been a pretty hectic week. So since we caught up last, we've had Remembrance Day, which is always a very special occasion here at the Australian War Memorial with thousands of visitors, as well as laying wreaths and the like. So we actually were able to see what you and I spoke about previously, actually see it in action in a form of active commemoration through remembrance. So that was last week. We've also had, I had some rock concerts with Coldplay and Pearl Jam. But I'm interested in this
disappointed,
audience.
mate. I thought you were going to say you were performing in rock concerts, mate.
For some reason, they don't need to see a 45-year-old historian playing air guitar. No one wants to see that, or air drums, to be honest. Then I'd lose all credibility. That little thin margin I may have would just totally go rocking out to Alive with Pearl Jam. But what we did do is, so on the weekend, a very special history conference down in Melbourne, hosted by Military History and Heritage Victoria. And that was a one-day conference or symposium looking around the theme of In the Fight, Australia's involvement in the Burma campaign, which also supported this new publication that's come out of In the Fight, and all the different book contributors, myself included, were able to travel to Melbourne and speak to a great audience, talking about our book, talking about the research that went into it, the stories from the book itself. My chapter, for example, is looking at Australia's involvement in Special Forces operations in Southeast Asia Command, which is something probably a lot of people hadn't really even thought about. So, for example, in early 1942, there's a small group of Australians who joined the British military mission 204, and they went into China to try and train the Chinese forces to fight against the Japanese. And there's also a number of other Australians who were already in Southeast Asia who were then recruited by SOE, or the Special Operations Executive, to become part of SOE, to perform those clandestine operations in Singapore, well, initially Singapore, but then later on Burma, India, China, Malaya. So you had Australians serving directly in the British forces, men and women. There's at least 5 Australian women who worked with SOE. In the Southeast Asia. And then you also had a number of Australians from the Australian military forces, so the guys from Z Special Unit, as well as the Air Force and the like, being seconded to SOE to conduct these operations. So it's a pretty interesting conference. But then other people also spoke about Australian soldiers in Burma, the Australian Navy and the Air Force. There's a very interesting topic on the WW2's, which is a British civilian administration supporting the British military forces. And again, you had individual Australian women working with this organisation to support the British troops. And then, so that was the conference on Saturday. And then on Sunday, we had the book launch at the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne. And it was very special because there are actually a few descendants of the people who mentioned in the book were able to participate and see their mothers and a father see these stories come together in a wider context, because people knew about what their father did in one instance or what their mothers did in a couple of others, but to put it into that context of Australia's war in Burma, which we hate to use that expression forgotten, but when you're talking about the Forgotten Burma campaign, Australia's involvement in that theatre of operations in Burma, Malaya and China it's like the forgotten of the forgotten. So it's a really interesting work, and it's a very significant publication. It's available out now.
Fantastic. In the Fight. I'm going to reinforce what you just said about forgotten battles, because I'm supposed to be a historian and I know absolutely nothing about the fighting in Burma. I know there's some excellent work that's been done on the topic, and a mate of mine, Robert Lyman in the UK, is an absolute expert on the topic. And so I really have to look into that some more. I'm making a note right now for a future podcast, Burma. Let's allocate that and dig right into it.
That's a great topic. There's so much there, and really, it's brand new. Like Well, it's not brand new for many people, but it's a relatively new topic. It's fresh, and a lot of people just aren't really aware of it. And there's several thousand Australians. There's at least 5,000 Australians who serve in the theatre. The challenge or the problem has been that in the main, they were individuals. So they weren't really tracking those Australian units. So it's easy, the 16th Brigade, 6th Division, 7th Division, for example, or specific RWF squadrons. Those big units are easy to follow. But in the case of Southeast Asia Command, in the main, it's individual Australian soldiers, airmen, nurses who were just serving as part of that wider British experience. And that's, I think, probably why that story gets lost. You do have Australian warships in the Indian Ocean, and you can follow those ships like the N-class destroyers, for example. But in the main, the story is just a little bit overwhelmed. And partly, too, it just is because of the immensity of the conflict. Naturally, and what we'll do this morning, talking about Australia's involvement in the South West Pacific Theatre, that is where our focus is, because, it's on Australian territory, it's in our backyard. Most Australians serve in this theatre, but we've got Aussies elsewhere as well.
It's fantastic, mate. And as I said, it's a gap in my knowledge not to know more about Burma. I think when we say the word Burma associated with World War II, everyone naturally thinks about the Burma Railway, which we now call the Thai Burma Railway. But the campaign there is absolutely extraordinary, the small amount I do know about it. So, yeah, we'll absolutely come back to that, mate, because I think it's a story that needs to be told. And obviously you have some fresh insights into it because of the conference and the book launch. So we'll definitely come to that one.
Rob Lyman participated. Peter Stanley was involved, who you just had on recently. So it's one of those areas where people sort of gravitating towards too, looking for those new stories. And the significance of these actions, time to reassess them 80 years after the event.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it dovetails neatly with what we're talking about today because you and I had some email exchanges before this recording, and we'd suggested a few topics that are relevant at the moment because of key anniversaries of the Second World War. But then you made the great suggestion, why don't we do them all? And I think that's a great idea. So we're going to break down some of these key anniversaries, key events that happened at about this time of year in various years of the Second World War. We're going to talk about the sinking of HMAS Sydney, which is always an important topic. We're going to talk about the end of the Kokoda campaign, and we're going to talk about Bougainville in 1944. So, I mean, some pretty big topics there. I think over the years, we've probably addressed these individually in podcasts, but stories really worth telling. And the thing I love about it, Karl, is that we're finding out new stuff about it all the time, aren't we? It's not like these are static chapters of history that we don't know anything new about. We're constantly reevaluating, we're constantly discovering new things, and it's really painting a much broader picture of our understanding of the Second World War.
Oh, absolutely. And Sydney is one of those great stories. Well, not great is not the right word. It's not the appropriate word, I should say. But Sydney is one of those stories that has really follows a very strong arc from its celebrated service in the Mediterranean in 1940, the tragic loss of the warship, the mystery surrounding the loss of HMAS Sydney for some 60 years. So there's a great unknown. And then the story is reconnecting again with the discovery, the announcement of the discovery of the wreck of Sydney and Cormoran. So almost that closed that loop with the unknown. And then it was only 3 years ago that the unidentified unknown Australian sailor from Sydney was identified and actually named. And so you have a whole closing the loop of the Sydney story. And it also shows too that these stories are not static. People are always asking new questions. There is new discoveries. In the case of Sydney, it's interesting because unlike delving into the archives and documents or oral histories in the way we did for Burma or we could do for Kokoda and Bougainville, with the Sydney story, it was about science, it was about technology. It was about the searching, like the maritime archaeology to discover and locate the wrecks, and then later on years of DNA testing as well as that desktop study to identify who the potential person for could be. So there's a lot of things going on, and that's just in that Sydney story. And then you can apply that to other parts of Australia's experience in the Second World War and even really military history more generally.
Well, let's why don't we break that down? I mean, you've inadvertently given a fantastic overview of the entire story of the Sydney, but let's break it down a little bit more. Tell us about the Sydney, what were her origins, and talk to me firstly about that success in the Mediterranean, and then obviously leading to 1941 when she was lost.
Yeah, so Sydney was a modified light cruiser, a light Leander cruiser. It was commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy in 1935. It was armed with 8 6-inch guns, as well as other secondary armament. And it was sleek, it was modern, and it was fast too. So HMAS Sydney, or HMAS Sydney 2, to be precise, because there was a Sydney 1, which served in the First World War. The HMAS Sydney 2 was a sleek, modern battleship at the outbreak of the Second World War. It deployed to the Mediterranean theatre in 1940, along with a small number of other Australian warships, where it operated in the Med with the Royal Navy. And Sydney actually had a lot of success under the commander of Captain Collins, sinking or finishing off an Italian destroyer, and then later on sinking an Italian cruiser as well. So Sydney completed its tour of the Mediterranean and came back to Australia in late 1940 and was really celebrated very much. It was the pride of the Royal Australian Navy. And then it went to the city of Sydney. The ship's company disembarked. They had a massive parade. The captain, Collins, was given the key to the city and the right of entry. And so the city of Sydney really got behind really got behind HMAS Sydney. So in 1940-41, HMAS Sydney was the pride of the Royal Australian Navy and is probably its best known warship. And then later on in the war, so towards that back end, deploys to the western side of the country and is involved in escorting ships, shipping backwards and forwards, heading up into the Netherlands East Indies, which takes us to November of 1941, where Sydney was escorting a troop ship into the Netherlands East Indies. They met its escort point. Troop ship was figuratively handed over, and then Sydney was returning back to Fremantle in WA when on the 19th of February in the early afternoon, about 1:30 in the afternoon, it sighted initially, it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sighted a suspicious vessel on the horizon and then approached this unknown ship.
There's been a lot of criticism of the captain and the commanders of the Sydney that they didn't do a very good job in terms of being cautious about approaching an unknown ship. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
It is one of those criticisms. I should also mention too that when Sydney returned from the Mediterranean, it also had, in addition to receiving the keys to the city of Sydney and being celebrated, there was a changeover in crew and personnel. And so Sydney, when it deployed to the Indian Ocean, had a new captain, Captain Joseph Barnett, and there are many other new officers and ratings aboard Sydney. So it was a bit of a turnover of personnel. So in the 1941, so still in late 1941, there were suspicions of German warships in the area, submarines. There's always that threat. And also, too, a menace from German raiders, auxiliary cruisers. And so during the First World War, this is what the Germans had with, say, the Raider Wolf, or more better known to Australian audiences with SMS Emden, which was hunted down by Sydney 1. And then some 25 years later or so, it's almost like the descendants are continuing the fight. And so you do have this German raider Cormoran lurking, menacing, harassing ships, allied shipping and the like, as well as deploying sea mines. And so they are thought to be in the area as a possibility in the area. But there's also a whole bunch of other allied merchant shipping or neutral merchant shipping also in the area, as well as warships. So there's actually quite a bit going on, which is why when Sydney saw this suspicious vessel, it kind of closed and kind of got closer and closer to suss out who it was. The suspicious vessel identified itself as being a merchant ship. Sydney was a little bit suspicious, though, and continued to approach until about 5:15. And by 5:15 in the afternoon, the two ships were almost astern, so almost line to line. The vessel itself was still acting a little bit suspicious in its signalling, and then in terms of its signals and the way it was sort of going about its business. And then finally at 5:30, Sydney actually, when they're only 1.5 kilometres away from each other, Sydney actually challenged it again, saying like, basically, who are you? What is your intention? And at that moment, that's when the ship dropped its disguise, ran up the German naval ensign, and then opened fire and engaged Sydney.
If this was just, we don't want to get too bogged down on the specifics, but I'm just fascinated to know, if this was a German raider, a ship disguised as a merchant ship, how did it have enough armament on board to cause the destruction of the Sydney?
Yeah, it's a really fair question. And Cormoran, I've been alluding to this suspicious vessel because that's how the Australians knew about it. They just thought it was a suspicious merchant ship. But actually, it was a German raider, the cruiser Cormoran. Cormoran itself was armed with six guns, six 5.9-inch guns, so the guns were slightly less and slightly smaller than the guns on Sydney, but still nevertheless quite formidable. And they were hidden. So on the deck of Cormoran, they're on the deck, the large guns are on the deck, and they basically were hidden by the size of the ships, like the vessels. And so the way I've always thought about it, and when looking at drawings of Cormoran, was that when, like those old ye olde warships, like your sailing ships, they pull up the sides and stick the cannons out, something similar to that. And so that's how they were able to disguise the larger guns, because they had these elements they could lift and like the side of the hull and then protrude the guns and then to engage. And then also Cormoran had a large number of smaller secondary armaments, including a 20mm anti-aircraft gun, which was also on board. Plus it was loaded with sea mines and various other secondary arms. Sydney also had secondary armament, but Cormoran's was able to fire first. And so Cormoran revealed its identity as a German warship. It was under the command of Captain Theodor Detmers, who was a very experienced German naval officer. And Cormoran dropped its disguise, ran up the German ensign, and also fired first. So it engaged Sydney first. Sydney returned fire almost immediately, but the first shots from Sydney's guns straddled Cormoran, whereas Cormoran was able to hit Sydney first, and then just kept on pounding and pounding and pounding the cruiser. So Cormoran had the advantage in that it fired first and they were quite close, and also because they were close, that negated the advantage Sydney would have had by having larger guns, bigger and more guns, which they could have fired if they'd just been firing from a distance. So that's partly one of the criticisms of Sydney and Burnett. Why did Sydney get so close? Why didn't just sort of, if it was suspicious, why not just use this advantage of distance and just fire into Cormoran? But they're one of those things that were, well, not fire into it, but at least challenge it from a distance, fire it, give it a shot across the bow type of thing. But we'll never really know. There was a similar example a little bit early in the war when HMAS Canberra was involved in challenging another suspicious vessel, and it was more cautious, stood off, fired a couple of warning shots, and the other ship were able to work out his identity, and also was another Axis vessel. But the captain of Canberra at that time was then criticised for an excessive use of ammunition, being too gung-ho, and being cautious. So it's possible that Barnett was aware of this criticism and didn't want to emulate what he thought or may have thought was a mistake. But the other thing to keep in mind is we don't actually know. Like, we don't know what conversations took place in the bridge. There was a large number of experienced officers, both from the Royal Australian Navy as well as the Royal Navy, and we just don't really know exactly, and we'll never know now, what was taking place. But beyond the fact that they actually drew very, very close, Cormoran fired first, took some initial hits, and Sydney returned fired as much as it could, but Cormoran just got onto Sydney very, very, very quickly.
1.5 kilometres is basically point blank if you're talking naval rounds. They could fire 20, 25 kilometres a lot of the time, effectively across the horizon almost. That's point blank range. And you make a good point. We'll never know. And the reason we'll never know, of course, is Sydney was lost with all hands. Is it the greatest naval tragedy in Australian history?
It certainly is yes, from a naval point of view, it is. And it was a real short, very bloody fight, and also incredibly intense. So Cormoran fired first, Sydney returned fire, Cormoran continued to fire. So with Cormoran's larger guns, so those 5.9-inch guns, its bigger guns were targeting the Sydney's gun turrets and the larger we call it the superstructure, but they were taking out those bigger guns of Sydney. So, and then Cormoran's smaller armaments, so the 20mm anti-aircraft gun and various other smaller guns, were targeting the bridge and the areas on the deck as well. So it's quite likely that within a couple of minutes, Barnett and the other officers and ratings on Sydney's bridge were probably killed or wounded. Very quickly, there was fire on board Sydney, because there was a report of the aircraft. So Sydney had an aircraft, an amphibious aircraft, and it was ready to go. So it's hit, it's on fire. The fuel for the avgas is on fire. The side, when the Sydney is almost alongside Cormoran, Sydney's just being raked by small arms fire. In terms of Sydney's point of, and Cormoran also fires a torpedo. From Sydney's point of view, its front two turrets, A and B turrets, are hit and they're taken out of action very quickly. And then Y turret, so its turret at the rear, aft, is also hit quickly and taken out of action, but X turret keeps firing. One of the rounds from X turrets hits the funnel of Cormoran, and then the round goes into the engine and causes a fire within Cormoran itself. So Cormoran takes a hit, and it proves to be mortal, but Sydney is just getting pounded. And after about 15 minutes, 15 minutes into the action, Sydney fires 4 torpedoes. They all miss. The Cormoran, meanwhile, the torpedo that Cormoran fired hit Sydney between the bow, or hit in the bow between between A and B turrets. So Sydney's mortally wounded and is on fire and ablaze within about 15 minutes of the action. Turns away or drifts away from Cormoran, and then as Sydney drifts away from it, Cormoran that then exposes another side of Sydney, which is then getting smashed by Cormoran, and Sydney has stopped firing at this point. X turret's gone, and it's drifting off away. Meanwhile, Cormoran has also suffered damage. Has about 20 of its crew were killed or mortally wounded in the action. There's a fire in the engine, and Cormoran itself is actually full of sea mines. So that's part of the reason it had deployed to the Indian Ocean to deploy sea mines to interrupt and interdict Allied shipping. So Detmers is concerned that his ship is on fire, the engine doesn't work, it could blow up. And also Detmers, the German captain, is also worried about, well, here's one large modern warship, maybe there's others in the region. So they're like a lame sitting duck. And so into the evening, and the last shot from Cormoran is fired at 6:25 p.m. So it's been blasting Sydney for 55 minutes. Just horrific and intense. The Detmers orders evacuate ship. The Germans are getting out of Cormoran. One of their larger lifeboats, as the sailors are getting into it, overturns. So some other 80 German sailors are lost at sea. And then meanwhile, this time it's now late in the evening, around about 10:30 as the Germans are evacuating, they can see a glow on the horizon, which was Sydney at this point. And then by midnight, and then so we're tripping over into the 20th of November, that horizon, that sort of glow in the horizon has disappeared. And HMAS Sydney's lost. And that's it for about 60 plus years.
Shocking, isn't it? And lost with all hands. Is it about 645 men went down with the ship?
Yeah, absolutely. 645 men. 645 men, all hands are lost. And that includes 6 members of the Royal Australian Air Force, as well as 4 civilian canteen staff. So the remaining 635 are members of the Royal Australian Navy, as well as some members of the Royal Navy.
Okay, wow, it's just an extraordinary loss. Cormoran was lost as well. All of those men were captured. Mate, it's a fantastic summary. I mean, I want to talk about 2 things with you about the Sydney before we move on to our next topic. But firstly, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned how close the ship, the Sydney, was to the city of Sydney. I mean, it's named after our largest city. What effect did losing these ships? I mean, they're literally capital ships because they're named after capitals. We lost the Sydney, we lost the Canberra, we lost the Perth. What effect did losing these big ships have on the morale of those cities in particular, but the Australian population as a whole?
Well, it's a huge shock. So particularly because Sydney was just like literally a few months earlier being paraded newsreels, featured in newsreels as publications about Sydney that quickly appeared, and everyone knew the name of HMAS Sydney or HMAS Sydney too, which was relatively unusual. And then for it to be lost so quickly and in unknown circumstances. So the actions for on the night or the evening of the 19th and the 20th of November, when Sydney's lost, it's about 5 days before aircraft go out looking for Sydney. So initially, it's just it's overdue, so it's late. Doesn't immediately cause any concern, and then it's not until some 5 days later when another merchant ship reports in saying, "Hey, we just picked up this lifeboat of German sailors. Something's up," and so that's when the search goes out on the 24th of November to start looking for Sydney. Nothing they couldn't so aircraft, other shipping. Meanwhile, other German sailors being collected in their lifeboats, so they're being rescued and recovered. So people know there's this big fight had taken place, and Sydney is missing, but they have these German sailors. And in that search area for Sydney, the only thing that was ever recovered in that search area was a single Karl float, so like a lifeboat, so a Karl float and 2 naval life vests. That was it. So basically, Sydney disappeared off the face of the earth. Huge mystery. And And it wasn't just for those family members that they were killed, like the knowledge that they were killed is that they were missing. So they had no known grave, the circumstances were unknown, and it was a huge blow. And it wasn't until the 27th of November that the next of kin were informed, that's officially informed, that Sydney was lost, and they were lost with all hands. So it was a great shock and a massive blow. What your eagle-eared listeners would pick up on, though, so this is now the 27th of November, shocking news. But a week later, Japan enters the war, so December 7th. Then all of a sudden, we're now focusing on. So you have that happens. You have the loss of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. The British capital ships were also sunk by the Japanese aircraft. Again, there's Australian sailors on both those vessels who were killed. And then you have that disastrous couple of months of 1942, where you see the loss of Perth, the loss of Canberra. And so this is like one big hit after another from a naval point of view. Hugely shocking, but also takes place in that wider context of the fall of Singapore, the loss of Rabaul, and the attacks on Darwin. So it's like one blow after another. I think it's pretty hard now to pull out a response to one single incident, so 80 years afterwards, because it's just like one hit after another. It's like bang, 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 bang. So that's pretty horrific. And the Royal Australian Navy itself took a huge blow in that late 41, early 42 period with the loss of these vessels. So Sydney, Linklater and Perth and Canberra, because these were the biggest ships, the most powerful ships and best known ships within the Royal Australian Navy, large numbers of crews, like several thousand when you combined all three of those vessels, and they're gone. So it's a huge blow.
I hadn't actually thought about it in those terms before, Karl, that, we always think about sort of Pearl Harbor as the beginning of Australia feeling really under threat. But you're right, it's only a month earlier that we lost Sydney. So we can go, the loss of Sydney, Pearl Harbor, Japan enters the war, the bombing of Darwin, the fall of Singapore. And then you go on to May and we've got midget submarines coming into Sydney Harbour. We've got Kokoda. I mean, you're absolutely right. Milne Bay. This was just a succession of, horrific news. I mean, Milne Bay wasn't. There was a victory. But, we've just got, as you say, blow after blow. It's just one of the most extraordinary times in our history.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's why there's that pull of 1942. So a lot of what we talk about tends to be that theme of what's remembered or what's not remembered or what's unknown, even say with the Burma example earlier. But it's because there are so many things happening. And in terms of it, lots of things happening that are incredibly dramatic. They're unprecedented. And yet it's just one blow after another after another. And it's why I think there's no really one or two key points that people remember, because there's just so many things to think about. But it also, we have to keep in mind too, of that individual loss and connection. So the families and friends of those 645 men, that lived with them forever. That's partly why the story of HMAS Sydney endured when possibly the memory of Perth and Canberra faded a little bit after the war, because there was lots of ships were lost, lots of people became POWs. But with Sydney, it was one of the enduring mysteries of Australia's involvement in the Second World War was what happened to those 645 men. And that interest and that desire continued for decades after the conflict. That's why there was still, so it was an enduring mystery and legacy. There were multiple investigations into the fate of Sydney, umming and ahhing around who the remains of that unknown sailor. Well, so that was happening. And then we'll go back a little bit too. You also have in that February period, 1942, when everything else is happening across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, there's another badly shot up Karl float with the very badly decomposed remains of a sailor is recovered just off of Christmas Island and taken back to Christmas Island. The unknown sailor is buried in Christmas Island, and the Karl float is then sent to Australia. But very quickly, or very soon after that, the Japanese invade and occupy Christmas Island. The grave is lost or forgotten, and the Karl float that was sent back to Australia was also lost afterwards. And so for years afterwards, after these events, there was this suspicion, yes or no, was the remains of that sailor, were they from Sydney or someplace else? And if you look in the official history, so Herman Gill's first volume of the Navy volume of the official history, it says that this sailor probably belonged to another merchant ship that may have been sunk in the Indian Ocean. But then in the decades that followed, people went back and looked at it and thought, oh, no, it's actually probably the remains of an Australian sailor from Sydney, looking at the tides, the charts, various other things that were other source material they were able to do. And eventually, too, they had to go back, relocate the grave, and he was brought back to WA and then buried, was buried again, but as an unknown sailor from HMAS Sydney. So there's so many different parts of this story. But in that wider context, there's just so many things going on. Like, it's really hard to keep track of everything. And in the context of 2024, it'd be really, really hard to compare.
There was something else going on at this time, mate, too, which was pretty significant, particularly for you in 2024 now, looking back, was the opening of the Australian War Memorial. Occurred at about this time as well, in 1941. I mean, that's pretty significant as well. And the Karl float was a key part of the early days of the memorial, wasn't it?
Oh, it certainly was. So the memorial opens on the 11th of November, 1941. A week later, we have the action with Sydney Cormoran, where Sydney's lost. And then that first Karl float that I mentioned, the one that was recovered in the debris field, which had the two life vests with it as well, that then went on display into the War Memorial's new naval gallery in June of 1942, so mid-year. So it's only 6 or 7 months after the action. And Karl float went on display in the galleries here. It's significant for a couple of reasons. One, because it was, I think it's probably what was the first, or one of the first items or objects from what was the Second World War, which was then a current conflict and wasn't even called the Second World War then, but from that current conflict going into the Shrine and Museum for First World, into the War Memorial. So it's like one of the first things. And then secondly, too, for some 6 decades, the Karl float was the only real tangible connection to the loss of HMAS Sydney and those men who were killed. So it was the Karl float itself is an important object from the memorial's from the history of the memorial's collection point of view, but the Karl float itself is also and was a shrine to those men who died. So it serves two purposes, and it's pretty much been on display continuously for nearly some 80 years because it's one of those key items in the collection and a real significant point of contact.
Mate, what was the connection between the First and Second World Wars at the Australian War Memorial? I mean, the War Memorial was originally conceived as a First World War memorial and museum, and it just so happened over the passage of time, it coincidentally opened during the Second World War. Did that affect the vision for the War Memorial? Did it change what the original intentions were? The fact that it was opened during a second and an effectively even larger conflict?
It didn't change the intention or the vision, but it meant in practice it became difficult to execute because it was a museum and it was a shrine to the Great War. And then all of a sudden it's in the midst of another bigger and bloodier conflict, or bloody conflict in terms of global scale. And so really from the very outset, we've never had the space, the memorial never had the space to collect items and also tell those stories that we wanted to tell. And so very quickly to the remit of the War Memorial expanded to include what became known as the Second World War, and then in the years followed. And so that was a key moment, I guess, too, in the decision to, and it's also just given that we would do it as an assumption that we would include the Second World War stuff as well as the First World War. So there was a key moment when they were like, all right, this isn't just a shrine to the Great War, it's going to encompass everything. So that was probably a consequence of the War Memorial opening during the midst of the Second World War. Whereas if you look at other places, so in Canada, for example, its First World War shrine remained a First World War shrine. There wasn't then an effort to include all the other conflicts that came afterwards or the ones that came before. Whereas with the War Memorial, it's like, no, we're going to do, and over time too, Second World War, Korea, so extended into current conflicts or more subsequent conflicts. Then also in the 70s onwards, looking backwards to include those other earlier colonial conflicts. So it's sort of changed. But really, one of the bigger takeaways was the execution of it, in that we've never had enough space to tell the stories we wanted to tell, which saw this then the expansion of the wings of the War Memorial in 1960s and 70s to build those new First and Second World War galleries. And then from the 1990s onwards, we've always had that sense of continuing expansion and evolving to include more recent stories of what were then more recent conflicts, to be more inclusive.
And of course, the huge redevelopment that's currently taking place. It's an evolving story. I mean, sadly, in some ways, because there's always another conflict, and it's almost like, in effect, the Australian War Memorial from that moment was playing catch up, because there was no way of predicting what conflicts were to come, and sadly, we just keep rolling them out. So
Yeah, and there's
it's interesting the development of the memorial.
And there's a very strong connection between the two. So in the Second World War, John Trelaw, who was so Charles Bean was his idea for the War Memorial, official First World War war correspondent, then wrote the official histories, and then it was his vision that created the War Memorial. But John Trelaw was a director. After the First World War, really for the establishment of it. And then during the Second World War, John Trelaw became the director. He was head of the military history section. And so he's going out, working with the army to collect records, to do all the things that he and Ben had done during the First World War, to do it again during the Second World War. So they're collecting items, collecting objects from the battlefield, photos, film, etc. There's a really strong connection between the two of them. You also have things such as Bean's relationship with Gavin Long. So in 1943, when Gavin Long is appointed the general editor of what will become then the Second World War official histories, Bean and Long worked together quite well. A lot of people don't know this, but actually when Bean finished writing his last volume, so the 1918 volume of his official history, he seems to have been, which came out in the early 1940s. I think Bean was at a little bit of a loose end, and he actually volunteered his services to Gavin Long to write one of the volumes of the Second World War official history. So Bean put his hand up to write about Syria. And Long was like, cheers, thanks, but no. But they had a very strong relationship, particularly in the early part.
I think Australia had seen enough
the Second World War
of
official
Bean by
histories.
then, perhaps. So
yeah, pretty much.
I think we'd seen a lot of him, and he was not doing his best work by the 1918 volume. He was a bit tired, so I think that was probably a sensible.
It was a good call from Gavin Long's point of view.
I think so, mate. A couple of other key anniversaries we should get to. I mean, we could, and I think we can and will do future entire podcasts on these topics. But this is just a nod to these chapters of history, which is so important. So in November, also the Kokoda campaign came to an end, which is obviously from Australian military history pretty significant. Just give us your quick overview about why that was so significant and what was actually happening at this time in November when the Kokoda campaign officially came to an end.
Yeah, so we're rolling through that 1942 period. So the Kokoda campaign starts in July of 1942 when the Japanese land on the northern beaches of Papua. They make their way across Yowen Stanley's, not just walking, actually fighting some very fierce actions against the Australian soldiers. So you've got the loss of Kokoda, Isarava, Brigade Hill, getting to Uriabaiwa in sort of September, or in Itamata Ridge, Uriabaiwa, September. And so that second part, and that's really where people are really familiar with. When we talk about Damien Pereira earlier, that was with Kokoda Frontline. That's what people are seeing. That's their image of the Kokoda campaign. And really, even today, even with the Isarava Memorial, people are locked into that notion of the Australian withdrawal, which is like the first part of the Kokoda story. But then from September onwards is the follow-up, so that we now have the Japanese withdrawing back across the Yowen Stanley Range. So South Seas Force is withdrawing. The Australians are pursuing the Japanese back across the Yowen Stanley, and we have those actions at Templeton's Crossing and then Eura Creek. On the 2nd of November, 1942, the first Australian soldiers were able to walk back into Kokoda Village, led by the Australian 7th Division, led under the command of George Facey at the time. On the 3rd of November, there's a very famous Australian flag-raising ceremony in Kokoda Plateau, almost to say, yep, we're coming back. And then you've got the last actions that are fought along the Kokoda campaign at Oivi and Garari. And so these are two little villages, or they were villages, but two areas on that downward slope of the back end of the Kokoda Trail. Well, Kokoda Trail finishes Kokoda. You then have a foot track towards the beaches of Bougainville and Sanananda. The Japanese along those tracks with these little pockets of rear guards at Oivi and Garari, basically just finding a rear guard action to make sure the main body of the Japanese force are able to withdraw back towards the beachheads, and the Australians are then pursuing them. And so you have these very bloody actions around the 4th of November to the 13th of November, where units from the 16th and the 25th Brigade, the Australian 16th and 25th Brigades, fight these zero actions to really eliminate and destroy those little pockets of Japanese resistance along the Kokoda Trail. And then it's around about the 13th of November or mid-November, the Australian forces then cross the Kamusi River. And that's kind of the crossing of the Kamusi River, which occurred around about the 13th of November, is seen as the end of the Kokoda campaign. They kind of bookmark it. So you've got the start in July with the Japanese landing, and then it finishes in November with the Australians wrapping up and pretty much liberating the villages along the route of the Owen Stanleys along the Kokoda Trail.
But to paraphrase Winston Churchill, this was really the end of the beginning, wasn't it? Because we had a whole series of battles which would follow Kokoda. I mean, Kokoda steals the spotlight, but the fighting in New Guinea that went on for the next months and years from
Well, the
this
next through, even
was
just
some of the
in
most
Papua.
savage.
Yeah, and so in some ways too, like Kokoda is deceptively simple. You can break it down into those basic elements, and units involved from the Australian perspective were relatively small. It's a neat self-contained story. And by ending or wrapping up the official end of the campaign on the 13th of November, it's really it's a very simple bookmarking of the campaign, because it's still largely all conducted by Australian units under Australian control, still fighting the Australian territory, but just to destroy the Japanese. And the other thing, which partly why Oivingarari is so significant, is by this time the Australian forces are able to operate very successfully in the jungle. They're quite experienced there's quite experienced soldiers fighting jungle warfare. They're harnessing the ability to combine those combined arms with machine guns, mortars, starting bringing artillery to isolate the Japanese, and they're operating in the jungle very effectively. They can outflank the Japanese, they outmaneuver, they're incredibly confident. And so there's a big difference from when those first actions took place along in this area around Oivingarari in July, when you had the first contact with the 39th Battalion. Fast forward to 4 months. So initially, the Australian soldiers were really hesitant, quite reluctant. They stayed to the tracks. They weren't going to go into the jungles. And they were susceptible to being outflanked by the Japanese, who were more confident operating in the jungle. Fast forward 4 months, and they're still largely the same units, like they're still from the 16th Brigade and the 25th Brigade. They'd already been fighting for several weeks. So these guys were physically tired. They'd fought through Templeton's Crossing, fought through Yora Creek. So they'd already done a fair bit of fighting and were relatively sick. But they're able to operate in the jungle very successfully, and outflank and outmaneuver and just destroy the Japanese. So you have that success and that big tick of becoming successful jungle warriors, And then from the back end of November into December and then January 43, that's when you move into those very bloody beachhead battles of Bougainville and Sandananda. But those actions are quite different. They're bigger, they're bloodier. You have the Americans involved. You also have more artillery from the Australian perspective, more air power. So the nature of that fighting in the beachheads is quite different to the Kokoda Trail. So it's kind of convenient to break Kokoda and the beachheads into two separate actions, because the units, the rationale, and the commanders are quite different. And it's in the beachheads, that's where you've got Eichelberger going with Herring, Ned Herring, sort of working together. So you have the Australians and Americans coming together for the first time in this theatre to operate. MacArthur's still overseeing stuff, but the dynamic is totally different for those beachhead battles compared to the early parts of Kokoda.
It's interesting, mate. You mentioned the Americans. I once spoke to an American veteran who, I think almost uniquely, had served both on Guadalcanal, where he'd been wounded, and then when he was sent back for whatever reason, he was reallocated and found himself in New Guinea, and then fought at the beachhead battles. And he said that the beachheads were much worse than anything that had gone on at Guadalcanal, which is quite extraordinary, because for Americans, Guadalcanal is considered that the epitome of that tough Pacific fighting, particularly in that early part of the war.
Yeah, the beachheads are horrific. So you've got the Japanese are well dug in, well prepared. They have trenches, they have pillboxes. Unlike, say, in the Western Front, you have concrete pillboxes. In the beachheads, they're timber, coconut plantations, coconut wood. So timber constructions, overhead cover, clear fields of fire, lots of machine guns, small numbers of artillery. And also, too, the Australians were, while they've just mentioned they became adept to manoeuvre warfare in the jungle, once they move to the beachhead areas, because it's open field, they're plantations, it's a different type of movement. So some of those initial attacks look like First World War attacks. It's just in this tropical environment, but they also suffer horrendous casualties. So that's partly why it's called the Bloody Beaches, because they're very, very heavy casualties. The Japanese aren't going anywhere. A small number, the Japanese actually from Rabaul being reinforced to strengthen the beachhead area, because they don't want to lose their little toe hole in Papua so they can make a future counterattack. So they're reinforcing the beachheads at some point. they're bringing forces in, so they're not going anywhere. So basically, the Japanese are going to fight to the death. As the weeks and months continue, because it's hot, it's wet, it's humid, there's a lack of rations from the Japanese perspective. Both Australians and Japanese soldiers at some points wear gas masks because of the stench from the dead.
Wow.
You have the Australians employing tanks, so Stuart tanks are going into the action. They're knocked out by the Japanese. There are actually reports that the crew of the Stuart tanks are then recovered by the Japanese and they're butchered and then eaten. So it's a pretty horrific. And also, too, this is when you first examples of Japanese cannibalism of Japanese bodies starts to occur as well. So there were these incidents at Euro Creek earlier, but this is sort of the first Japanese on Japanese action. It's very interesting, but also incredibly complicated and horrific fighting. Those Bougainville and Santa Ana actions.
Yeah, that this flag behind me, I think, came from the beachhead battles. That were one of the Americans picked up this Japanese flag from the body of a Japanese soldier that had been killed. So again, I think at some stage, mate, we'll definitely do an entire podcast to really dig into these chapters because they're just fascinating and a bit overlooked. Kokoda does steal the limelight somewhat, and I think the beachheads in particular should be better known. And moving on to 1944, another one that I know you and I are both big fans of. Bougainville. The Australians arrive at Bougainville, take over from the Americans. And again, I've spoken to, it's really funny, I did a lot of work on the Pacific War over the last 15 years or so. And maybe if we're talking 15 years ago when I was doing this work, it was mostly on the American involvement in the Pacific War. So I spoke to a lot of American veterans, including an American who had fought in the initial landing at Bougainville in 43. And I was actually very privileged in 2012. I took him back to Bougainville. We went to Torquay where he had landed in 43 and we walked the ground. Actually, he captured a small island in the bay and we actually walked that ground. And it was amazing. This is a little bit of a tangent. It's a little bit self-indulgent for me, but one of those special moments, really special moments of my life was we went in a little boat. We were on a cruise ship. We went on a little boat and went into the beach and landed in Parada Island on the beach. And he is an 87-year-old man, or however old he was. That was his second time being on that beach, and the first time was when he was 18 and was describing bullets chipping off the gunnels of the boat as he came ashore. So that's Chuck Meacham. I think he's still with us. I think if he's not still with us, he only passed away very recently, but I think he might still be with us. Marine Raider, absolute legend of a guy, and I walked the whole island with him and told that story. So that was in 43 when the Americans landed. But then it was a bit of an odd one, wasn't it? Because this is a huge island, Bougainville. It had a very big Japanese garrison, but the Americans had effectively bypassed it, isolated the garrison. So once the Americans had established a perimeter, built a couple of airfields, it became just a large encampment, but not a lot was going on from a fighting perspective. Until the Australians arrived. So tell us a little bit about the transition from the live and let live attitude of the Americans to the Australians taking the fight to the Japanese.
Yeah, well, the two campaigns are really actually, there is a connection because a consequence of the bloody casualties of Bougainville and Santa Ana from both the Australian and the American perspective was never again. Like, we don't need to go in and smash the Japanese headbutt them and just take them out. What occurs from 1943 onwards, particularly as the Allies get stronger with material, so that is aircraft, artillery, and also shipping, is a move, and this is what happens during the 1943 New Guinea campaign, the offensive campaign. It's just to outmaneuver the Japanese. So you don't need to destroy them every base. It's really just to outflank them, surround them, dominate them, destroy the aircraft, cut off their shipping, and then just leave them in the jungle, and we just move on. The consequence, and that's largely what was done throughout 1943, early 1944. During that period, you have the Australians and the Americans operating together very successfully, but then by 1944 onwards, the Australian forces are pretty much spent. They just had 2 years in Papua New Guinea kind of done. And then meanwhile, the Americans start to leapfrog. So they took land at Torquay and Bougainville, as you said, as well as various other places in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea to start leapfrogging in what becomes MacArthur's island hopping campaign. So that was very successful from the American perspective and MacArthur's perspective because they could start to move really quickly across Southeast Asia, bypass large areas of Japanese bases where they've been cut off and become effective largely it's described as self-contained garrisons, which is then what you see what had occurred on Bougainville from 43 into early 44, where you do have a very large American presence, but they defend the Torokina perimeter. They defend the perimeter, but they defend the airstrips because that's what's really important. It's the aircraft and the airstrips, using them as sort of because with the air power, they can then dominate the region. So that's why it's significant. But it does leave a large number of American troops in the rear, and as MacArthur's moving towards the Philippines, he wants those soldiers back. And then meanwhile, after a couple of months or almost a year of resting, there's a real push and move and desire to use Australian forces again and still to be involved in those actions that will defeat Japan. So bit of politicking, and the result of that is that the Australian forces, the 2nd Australia Corps, move to Bougainville, move over and take over Torokina, relieve the Americans, and the Australians take over Torokina, and then eventually go into a very aggressive campaign to clear the island from the Japanese and liberate Australian territory.
Now, about 500 Australians were killed during the Bougainville campaign, leading right into 1945, and the hometown hero from where I'm from, West Wyalong, Reg Ratty, earned himself, I think, the second last Victoria Cross of the Second World War for the Australians. Pretty tough fighting in Bougainville, and has been looked back on over the decades as potentially unnecessary. The Japanese were cut off. The Americans had established a very solid perimeter and were suffering very few casualties because there wasn't a lot of fighting going on. The Japanese on the island were occupying themselves with gathering food. I saw an account of the Americans was that the Americans set up as the Americans would do a baseball diamond and were playing baseball in their encampment within the perimeter. And a Japanese soldier used to wander out of the jungle every day and sit in the sidelines, watch the baseball game, and then just wander back into the jungle. So the Americans were definitely obviously taking very low casualties at this stage. Where do you stand on this controversy? I mean, I'm just going to ask you outright: did the Australians have to take the fight to a Japanese garrison that was cut off, isolated, and had no chance of surrender or escape or reinforcement?
Yes, is my short answer. So it's an unpopular answer, but there's a range of reasons for it. Essentially, when the Australians took over, they did have that period of live and let live with the Americans and the Japanese. The perceptions of the Japanese were that they'd been defeated. They weren't really a threat. They weren't going anywhere. And they were living in these largely contained garden areas and were a self-sufficient, self-contained, almost like a prison. And the view was that there were some 20,000 Japanese on the island. They weren't going anywhere, weren't really a threat, but they weren't going anywhere. From the Australian perspective, when the 2nd Australia Corps moves in and takes over, particularly under the command of General Savage, so from Savage's point of view, he has a large, and we're saying 2 corps, that's a division and a half. So ultimately, about 33,000 Australians serve in Bougainville. So it's a really big force to have just sitting around a beachhead, just twiddling their thumbs. So there's a lot of soldiers. Many of them are quite young, keen, ready to go. If you look at one of those brigades, the 29th Brigade, for example, or even the 7th Brigade, who had previously fought at Mill Bay, only about a third of those guys in 1944 were veterans from the early 1942 period. So you have quite a turnover of young soldiers who want to have a go. So when I say young, 19, 20, 21, 22, if this would be their first campaign, they want to do something. There's a view that the Japanese are weak and can be overrun quite quickly. And the other thing is, too, the Australians don't want to have a large garrison force in the islands indefinitely. At this point in time, so in late 44, there is still the view that the war against Japan will continue, at least until 1946, and we can't afford to have a very large garrison just twiddling their thumbs. Hence the campaign that occurred in Bougainville under Savage's command, and he was aware of all these sort of debates and discussions, was to fight in an aggressive campaign within reason, and it's really to destroy the Japanese where this could be done relatively cheaply. What Savage and the other Australian commanders didn't know, though, were there are some 60,000 Japanese on the island rather than about 20, and they were really quite prepared to fight. But that only emerged from about mid-1945 onwards, that sort of knowledge. But by that time, the campaign had already happened and you're fighting on 3 axes, so there's different parts of the island. And some areas were more aggressive than others. So in the south, where Reid got his Victoria Cross. That's the southern part of the Bougainville campaign. That was the main sort of most aggressive part, but that's also because the Japanese were fighting to protect their garden areas. But there's also fighting in the north of Bougainville and also that central ridge in what became known as the central sector. So it's a complicated campaign, and it's only because really the war ends so suddenly, August 1945, then those early debates of, well, was it necessary, really kind of take hold. And for the men themselves, the emotions were quite mixed. And if you look at the contemporary records, say letters and the war diaries, they're like, oh, yep, let's have a go. But then it's shaped from post-war memories is really kind of shaped quite differently because, like, well, how come we were using these mopping up areas? Why didn't we get the media attention? Could have been used more effectively elsewhere? Or really, could they have been discharged and then go back and work for the Australian war effort or the Australian war industries and help support the war effort in different ways? So they're kind of those
Yeah.
questions that surround Bougainville as well as WEWAC.
And I know
in New
over a
Guinea.
beer, you and I have talked about this in the past and have somewhat differing views in some aspects of that. But that's why the study of military history is so exciting, because we can have those different views. And again, we will do a podcast on this and break it down in much more detail. But I should say, for anyone who's listening now and wants to know more about the Bougainville campaign, you wrote the definitive book about the campaign. Just remind us about the book, what it's called, and can people still get it?
The Hard Slog, Australians in the Bougainville Campaign, 1944 to 1945. You can, yes, it came out in 2012, but it's been still in print because it's now on print and demand by Cambridge University Press. So it's still around and out there. And also, we've done podcasts on different aspects of the Bougainville campaign in the past. So go back and listen to the back catalogue. And I've done book chapters and stuff like that. So there's quite a lot out there. It's a really big campaign. It's quite significant.
If you see the words Karl James and Bougainville together in any combination, check that out, because you are obviously the preeminent. You won't say this yourself, but you are the preeminent historian about the Australians in Bougainville, Karl.
Well, because there's no one else out there, really. It's just me and Gavin Long.
Revisiting and completing the work that Gavin Long never got to. Just before we wrap up, mate, one question I wanted to ask, because you and I have discussed a lot the importance of getting out there and walking the ground. Obviously not the Sydney. I don't imagine you've walked the ground of the Indian Ocean, but in terms of New Guinea, Bougainville, have you been to these places? Have you walked the ground where these actions occurred?
No. So the walking the ground is a really interesting thing. And in many ways, the context, one, everyone agrees it's vital. You do get this additional understanding from the terrain, the environment, the climate, like to see, experience heat and like proper heat and humidity. And so there's so many things going on. But I feel too, particularly if you listen to European or British and American historians, they have access to travel is so much easier in Europe. So, for example, listening to James Holland and Al Murray talking about Normandy or whatever, they can just get the train and go across and just walk the battlefields. It's a lot easier if you're in Europe. In the Australian perspective, you have the tyranny of distance. It's a lot harder and much more expensive to get to these Pacific War battlefields. And as a poor postgraduate student, and even as a poor public servant, sometimes you have that choice of, do you use the money? If you do have some money for grant money, do you spend it to go and explore a battlefield, or do you use it to pay for a trip to go to an archive? So you can actually look at these materials. And really too, sometimes it's quite expensive, hard to get to. It's not impossible, but it really does shape and limit what you can do at the end of the day. Because if you're a young historian, or even just a historian, sometimes if you have the funds, you'd rather go to an archive to get into those records, to ask those new questions, look and use source material. And at this point, it's a little bit tricky. And I think sometimes when the big discussion around walking the battlefield, yeah, it's great, but not everyone has that opportunity to do it. And sometimes it's really just, here's my pocket of money. Do I go to an archive, or do I walk the ground?
Mate, I'm smelling a signature tour to either New Guinea or a Guadalcanal coming up, co-hosted by Matt and Karl. I think that would be pretty great. A fantastic excuse to get out there and walk those battlefields.
Well, that's what I was kind of hoping at in a very subtle way.
Yeah, very, very subtle, mate. No, I picked up on that. No, I think that'd be fantastic. You heard it here first, folks. Look out for. I think we should definitely do a tour, particularly the beachheads. I don't know. I think my walking Kokoda days are past me, but definitely the beachheads and definitely Guadalcanal. Both fantastic.
Well, you throw in Milne Bay as well. So we talked about this previously, but you could do like start in Port Moresby, move up to Bamana, go up to the Owers Corner. Let's have a look at the start of the Kokoda Trail. You can walk down. You can do a day's walk. down to Goldie River and the like, and up to the Golden, or around about where the Golden Stairs began, or where they thought to have began. So that's a day trip, and then around to Milne Bay. So I went to Milne Bay in 2017, and that was an amazing experience. But even getting there is still quite tricky because we were going to go one day, but then because of the weather conditions, they cancelled the flight. So we went the second day, but that meant we lost a day on the ground. And I thought, even in 2017, the weather still plays a factor in getting to these locations. So you could do Milne Bay, and then you go around to the northern beaches, Boone, and go to San Fernando, and then you could go back up to Kokoda. So you can kind of bookmark it that way, and then off to Guadalcanal.
Mate, sounds amazing. I've done.
And we can point to the water and say, over there, that's the Battle of Coral Sea.
I always feel like that whenever I'm flying over the Pacific. I'm always looking at the water going, this is where these battles occurred, which is ridiculous because obviously there's nothing there related to the Second World War. But I've done Rabaul, I've done little bits of New Guinea, but I've done Guadalcanal extensively. I've done probably 10 or 15 trips to Guadalcanal. Mate, it's unbelievable. The Pacific battlefields are absolutely extraordinary. It's such a shame that it's so hard to get to them because more people should get over there and explore them. So maybe this is our opportunity, mate, to get a group of people over there. It'd be great to walk the ground with you. I'd absolutely love it. Watch this space. As we said, this might be something for the future.
You're the man to make it happen.
Mate, it's been fantastic. Some pretty key anniversaries in November. It's a busy time of the year. I've been saying this. I said this on my last podcast. We discussed it in the Remembrance Day podcast that there's a lot going on this time of year, both from the First and Second World Wars. But I mean, what a collection. We've just gone over the HMAS Sydney, the loss of that ship, the opening of the War Memorial, the end of the Kokoda campaign, and the Australians taking over in Bougainville in 1944. Just an extraordinary collection of important dates, which I'm sure we'll dig into in a bit more detail in future episodes. But, mate, it's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, as always.
No worries, man. It's great to have you. Great to have a chat and to participate in the pod again.
Yeah, we'll do it again soon, mate. Thank you.
No worries, dude.